We start tonight with breaking news. A Russian warplane has collided with a U.S. drone over the Black Sea. Washington saying that the incident was what it is describing as a reckless act by two Russian fighter jets. U.S. officials say one of the jets struck the propeller of the unmanned Reaper drone, one like you see right here in our file footage, and that it caused it to crash into international waters in the Black Sea. A U.S. Air Force official says that the maneuver almost caused one of the Russian planes to crash as well. All right, let's get the latest now from our correspondent in Washington, Michaela Kuffner. Michaela, according to the U.S. military, this incident was not an accident. What was it?
Yes, we actually heard from the Pentagon now that for 30 to 40 minutes, those Russian fighter jets were in the vicinity of that U.S. drone. And only then did they approach it. And in the end, one of the fighter jets touched one of the propellers, which was described as a reckless and dangerous maneuver by the U.S. side, which caused the drone to become unmaneuverable, unmanageable. And then the U.S. decided to bring the drone down themselves. The U.S. military actually brought down this drone. So that's what happened in international airspace, as was stressed by the Pentagon again. There was a question whether this was anywhere near Crimea in the Black Sea. The Pentagon spokesman said no, it wasn't, that this was safely in international airspace. And that's also why there is a very firm reaction and protest now from the U.S. side. So talks are being had at very high level between Washington and Moscow.
So we can confirm that this evening, Michaela, that there is direct communication taking place between Washington and Moscow over this incident.
Absolutely. That was confirmed by White House spokesman John Kirby earlier. We also learned that the Russian ambassador here in Washington, D.C. has been summoned, and that the U.S. ambassador to Moscow delivered a very clear message of protest. We don't know the exact wording of that. We weren't given that. But it was made clear that the U.S. side is protesting at what was time and time again by the spokespeople, and I've heard all of them today, from the White House, from the State Department, and from the Pentagon, as a reckless and dangerous maneuver. And
let's just talk about the neighborhood in which this took place. It took place over international waters, but there is an active war zone not far away in eastern Ukraine. I mean, that throws the possibility of this possibly being the beginning of something that could escalate further. I mean, have people been talking about that today, about the threat of this, blowing up into something much bigger?
Well, of course, alarm bells are ringing everywhere, particularly at NATO command, which initially put out the statement in relation to this. The U.S. president was briefed early morning here, U.S. time. This happened at 7:03 European time. And this is seen as something that, yes, it could escalate, but I think that's also why we're seeing the U.S. side make absolutely clear that they've exhausted all avenues of communication to actually get feedback from the Russian side, which doesn't really see any kind of ill behavior at this moment in time, as we've heard from a spokesperson there. But those talks about that exact situation will be a lot more detailed and nuanced. And yes, at the very least, this is a major diplomatic incident. At worst, it's something we don't even really want to speculate into. Luckily, this was only a drone. There was no U.S. life endangered, but it was piloted by the U.S. military directly, and therefore it is a direct contact between the United States, the leading country in NATO, and the Russians, who are waging war on Ukraine. So yes, it is significant, it is alarming, but at this moment it's still in the fact-finding stage, certainly from the U.S. side.
Yeah, important to point that out. Our correspondent, Michaela Kuffner, with the latest in Washington. Michaela, thank you. And our coverage continues now. I'm joined by Thomas Wiegold. He's a military expert and journalist. Mr. Wiegold, it's good to have you with us. And let me ask you as well, about communication between Washington and Moscow. I mean, is this the time when the White House and the Kremlin should be in direct contact?
Not necessarily. First and foremost, it should be a deconflicting contact on the military level. And as far as we know, there's a direct line between US EUCOM, headquartered in Stuttgart, Germany, and the military authorities in Russia. So this should be the first line of contact. Meanwhile, as we just heard, it's escalated to the diplomatic level. So the US Foreign Ministry, State Department is in contact with its Russian counterpart. So it seems there is contact at the moment, and this means deconfliction is going on.
Yeah, according to the Americans, this type of incident that occurred today is not uncommon, albeit it's still very reckless, what we saw. Talk to me about the danger level of this type of incident.
Well, we've seen in the past that Russian fighter aircraft had approached U.S. manned aircraft in what the U.S. calls an unsafe and unprofessional manner. Quite obviously, Russian pilots tried to coerce their U.S. counterparts, tried to move them off course. We had similar incidents with British reconnaissance planes earlier, also over the Black Sea, which led to interruption of British recce flights for a certain time. But this is the first time that this approach has led to a collision, to a mid-air collision, and that's a new quality and the escalatory quality of this incident.
Yeah, and this happened over international waters in the Black Sea. I'm wondering, what legitimate reason could a Russian fighter jet have to engage with a U.S. drone over international waters? Is there a reason?
None at all. The U.S. as well as NATO and also NATO countries are claiming they have the right to be there. They do. Just as on the other hand, Russian airplanes are routinely intercepted over the Baltic and international airspace by NATO aircraft, which means NATO aircraft is trying to identify and try to contact those aircraft. This, however, means that the Russians seem to have an interest to get those NATO aircraft piloted or unmanned off course, because they are flying in a pattern which allows them to pick up signals, for instance, from a Russian-controlled territory and getting reconnaissance and what we would call, or you would call, a spy aircraft.
Yeah. This drone is called the MQ-9 Reaper. It's a surveillance drone. I assume the Russians would possibly say that it could be connected directly to the war in eastern Ukraine. I mean, is that the thinking that one could assume at this moment?
Well, you could assume, but even if you say this drone is related to the war in Ukraine, it still has every right to fly in this international airspace. And luckily, the US and Russia are not at war. So from an international legal standpoint, for a Russian fighter pilot, this might be an unfriendly aircraft, but it's not an enemy aircraft.
Yeah. Military expert Thomas Wiegold, we appreciate your time and your valuable analysis tonight with this breaking news story. Thank you.